And please doing the translation.
No, we're not doing, for this session, we're not doing translation because the idea is that it can be a little bit more interactive. So it would have been like, but so the idea is that, you know, people still can ask for, if people ask questions, we can sort of retranslate if they ask in Spanish and you answer in English. Hola, buenos días a todas y todos. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a esta primera sesión plenaria donde estaremos realizando el workshop Qualitative Methods in Studies of the Legal Profession, Planning, Developing and Processing Interviews, que estará a cargo del profesor Pete Sanderson de la Universidad de Huddersfield del Reino Unido. El profesor Sanderson es profesor emérito de dicha universidad, fue director de la Escuela de Educación de la Universidad de Huddersfield y ha desarrollado una amplia carrera de investigación en el campo, digamos, social, en el campo de los estudios comunitarios, pero también en gran medida en el campo de la profesión legal, estudiando el tema de género y profesión legal, mujeres abogadas, el funcionamiento de los sistemas de asistencia judicial y por lo tanto toda la experiencia que nos puede traer aquí en esta sesión, la idea es que nos pueda compartir algunos aspectos metodológicos, en particular del proceso de realización de entrevistas, para pensar qué es lo que significa realizar una entrevista, cómo se planean, cómo se desarrollan y cómo podemos reflexionar sobre el contenido de estas entrevistas. Muchas veces hacemos entrevistas no realmente reflexionando sobre qué tipo de dato es el que nos aporta esta fuente fundamental en el campo de los estudios sociolegales. Esta sesión va a realizarse en inglés, ¿ya? Sin traducción simultánea, porque la idea es pensarla como una sesión más bien como más un workshop, más algo donde ustedes efectivamente puedan interactuar, donde también desde ustedes mismos puedan surgir preguntas. Si no se sienten cómodos haciendo las preguntas en inglés, nosotros podemos hacer una traducción consecutiva, digamos, y el profesor Sanderson responderá en inglés. ¿Ya? Entonces, without further ado, Pete, so you can start.
Is this one live?
Yes, this one is live.
Right, well, many thanks, Marianne, and many thanks to the Dean and staff of the Faculty of Social Science and Law for the invitation to be here, an unexpected privilege. So this is described as a workshop, and in the UK, a workshop would be in a small room, round a table, with lots of opportunities for me to see and learn your names, but there are people at the back who I can hardly see because my eyesight is so poor, but we'll do what we can. And this workshop on methodology, I think I would argue that issues around methodology are not about developing a template of research practice, but they're about understanding the way theory and experience can help us identify and address problems in tackling research issues that we're interested with. And I will approach this workshop in that spirit. So the aim is for me to identify the way in which the experience I've had over 40 years or more of doing research has led to many mistakes from which I hope I've learned, and I hope to share some of the mistakes and some of the learning with you. So here are the aims of the workshop, which are to share experiences and issues and problems which are involved in the use of interviews and other qualitative or ethnographic approaches in socio-legal research, to debate some key theoretical framing ideas in research, like the idea of how do the ideas of reliability and validity apply to doing interviews in the kind of context in which we might work. Can we find alternative criteria to apply to our work, such as authenticity? What's the nature and role of interpretation in dealing with interview data? And what are our rights as researchers in terms of interpreting the words and emotions and expressions of others? To what extent can we say that we are here, our work is designed to give voice to people? So what is our role in part as advocates of those we work with, particularly if they're marginalized and unheard? What do we mean by ethics in research? In the UK, this is, I think, a particular thorny question because ethics in the UK is about committees and it's about forms and it's about bureaucracy and it's not necessarily about doing research in good faith. So how do we negotiate the tightrope between those two things? I'd like us, if possible, together to identify some of the practical implications of some of the theoretical contentions for the processes of planning, developing, collecting and analysing qualitative data. And one thing I haven't put on the slide, but that I would emphasise is the issue of some kind of congruity between your epistemological position, your theoretical framing of a problem, the methodological approach you develop, and then the kind of technical aspects of the actual research practice you engage in. This is partly from my experience as a supervisor as much as my experience as a researcher, in that one of the key things that happens to PhD students in Aviva in the UK is when there is no congruity between the epistemological position and what people have actually done. So they say they're doing one thing from one epistemological position and then their actual work isn't the same. So that's the key issue. So these slides were intended to be like a checklist that we would all be sitting around the table looking at and going, yeah, I'd like to look at that one, but not that one, but this is going to be hard. So maybe what we can do is I'm going to go through them. And when I get to a slide where everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about and doesn't want to hear me talking about it, you could all boo and hiss. And if I pass over one, you could just shout out, no, go back. So, right, just to introduce what my experience has been, I've had 30 years experience working with Hilary at the front there on a range of issues in the socio-legal field, which have been to do with gender and the profession, to do with access to justice, to do with the professional knowledge of legal advisors. What do they know and how do they put that knowledge into practice in their relationships with clients? And also on the basis of work that I've done that I haven't mentioned there, which is to do with race and community cohesion in the United Kingdom, where I've used a range of qualitative methods, not just interviews, but some different methods I can talk about later on. And it's also based on years of work training doctoral students in the use of NVivo, which I assume quite a few people in the room will also have used. Right, well, this is where it was meant to be a workshopy thing. So I was meant to find out what you are really interested in and why you've come. This is going to be hard. So
Could do maybe some people who want to interview.
Yeah. We have a roving mic. So if anyone wants to talk about why they've come, what they particularly want to hear about, that would be good. Or Ignacio could just pick on people.
So, okay, so actually I was already, so I think I like to say I do legal ethnography, court ethnography in particular. And, but lately I've been wondering, so I'm into interactions, a lot from microsociology inspired kind of research. But now, and this is something I I would like to discuss if possible. I've been wondering about the meaning of what it means to do ethnographic research. What does it mean to have an ethnographic approach, which goes beyond just doing observation or doing interviews, more broadly? And what I hope to gain from the workshop, I think it's having the discussion on maybe some conceptual issues that sometimes we give for granted, and certain words that are complex, and I'm not always sure that we're understanding the same things. Even what you're saying about epistemology. Now there's been a shift to ontology as a conceptual discussion. So yes, that's those.
Hello. I will be trying to make this question in English. I'm training my English still. I'm Mauricio. I study theory of argumentation. My research currently has to do with the quality of deliberation in the Constitutional Convention that happened a few years ago here in Chile. And I use a method to assess quality of deliberation, which is called the Discourse Quality Index, DQE. And I'm interested to know how we can assess the reliability of some methods, because the Discourse Quality Index methodology is partially quantitative, partially qualitative. So I'm very interested to know how can we rely on qualitative methods. Thank you.
Hola, buenos días. Hago mi pregunta en español porque me da vergüenza hablar en público en inglés. Mi nombre es Malú Moreno, trabajo en una institución pública que es un observatorio de género en la justicia. Solemos hacer investigación aplicada que se dirige a mejorar el servicio de justicia en la ciudad de Buenos Aires. Y una línea de trabajo es hacer investigaciones con grupos en situación de vulnerabilidad.
Moreno, she works in the justice, the Observatory of Gender and Justice in the city of Buenos Aires, and a good part of their work is to do research and qualitative research, but working with vulnerable groups in vulnerable groups. So that poses some challenge.
Y uno de los temas que me interesa trabajar hoy tiene que ver con cuál es el límite entre dar voz a las personas en situación de vulnerabilidad a través de métodos etnográficos y apropiarse de esas voces y darles una expresión institucionalizada. O sea, ¿cuál es el límite entre usar el método etnográfico para acercar esos puntos de vista a un espacio institucionalizado y cuándo sería mejor traer directamente a las personas para que hablen por sí mismas?
So she's particularly interested in trying to see what's the limit between giving voice to the people that they're working with, and on the other hand, to what extent their role is to sort of translate this voice to these institutional spaces, and when would it be better to actually bring the people directly there, or actually the ethnographic or the work of the interviewee is to just take those voices and they translate those voices directly to these spaces.
Hello, my name is Basira Razabal. I am a legal scholar from Universidad de Chile. I would like to know your experience and the difficulties you have had in your work. But also, I think this is coming from my intellectual insecurities. Like, what is the contribution that legal scholar could do to social legal research that sociologists, for example, could not do? Like, if I work in a group of sociologists and social scientists, but I feel that my contribution is very limited to what I can, as a legal scholar, do in social legal research sometimes. So I would like to know your approach. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Felipe, a PhD student in sociology at the Universidad Católica. And I'm very interested in what is been called the methodological tribalism, this trend to kind of privilege or emphasize some kind of method over others due to their apparent capacity to gain access to the truth or the self of the inquiry object. And I'm interested in discussing how can we approach in a more maybe how do I say it, with different methods and not just relying on ethnography about interviews. Like ethnography is itself better than the other, and kind of avoid this trivialism.
Hi, my name is Amaya Alves. I'm a law professor, and I'm really interested in the language, like the way in which you frame the work you do as a socio-legal scholar, because sometimes I think we just speak different languages. I teach at the very traditional law school, and I'm so much more interested in what you do. So I just want to learn how to do it. And I also think I work with indigenous peoples that have a lot to do with talking, with speaking. Sometimes I have a lot of trouble to try to translate that, the beautiful conversations that I have, into a paper, like a legal scholar traditional paper. There is a, I don't know, like a abysm, a gap, something that there is something that you can't really bridge. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Someone else?
Quizás,
Hello.
quizás el último.
Sorry.
Yes,
El
the last.
último.
Yeah. My name is Pablo Fontealba. Came from the field of sociology. I work in the topic between sociology of law and criminology. My research focus is trying to understand to what extent the public endorse the liberal principles of criminal law, the shaping factors and consequences for trust and legitimacy of the criminal justice system. And I'm currently working in a research project that use mixed methods. So we have a first stage with quantitative measurements, and then we are going to have a two-stage with qualitative research. So I would like to know, we have some challenges during the research that we are not clear how to address them. So I would like to have maybe then some insights about how to solve these challenges, but can we comment then? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. ¿Más? No? Sí. Okay.
Yes,
Well,
bastante.
but yeah, it's a lot already.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm sure you're very familiar with the model of consultation where people ask everyone what they think about something, then do what they were going to do anyway. So that may be the approach I take, but I think some of the themes will just come up naturally in my discussion of the slides. If I miss anything out, then do remind me. I'll just say that the kind of theoretical frames for the research that Hilary and I have done have largely been drawn from Pierre Bourdieu and the idea of cultural practice, and his attempt to resolve the problems in the antinomy between structure and individual agency. and the way in which she does that through a conceptual framework that focuses on how structures are realized in individual embodiment, schemes of perception, and beliefs. A second one is my favorite book on methodology, which is now very, very ancient, is by Aaron Cicerel, and it's called Method and Measurement in Sociology. And I think it answers almost all the questions that people have asked. And I will be drawing on that a bit in my discussion of some of the things like interviews. And finally, again, you may be familiar with the work of James Spradley. I'm not sure. But he was very influential on me in reshaping what I thought an interview was about. So I'm not going to do this one because it will involve passing the microphone around and then we'll never finish. But the idea was to uncover some of the ranges of methods and different approaches that you've talked about, and they will come up anyway. So the first question was to look at what an interview actually is. One of the difficulties I always had as a teacher and also as a researcher is to think about whether an interview, what does an interview actually tell us? What is the data we get with an interview? And a lot of people tend to take what respondents say as an expression of factual experience or a factual model of their experience, an accurate recall, or a genuine remembrance of events that have happened to them. So it's subjective experience and narratives that you capture and then you reproduce through some form of magical interpretation. And then as I've forgotten your name already, but as you were saying, the issue is what are we doing when we disseminate this material? Who do we disseminate it to? When we disseminate it, are we doing justice or doing a disservice to the people who put their faith in this when they allowed us to interview them? So that was one thing. And I want to just kind of problematize the idea of an interview a little by looking at what some key authors have said about the process. Cicerel, who I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on, argues that interview encounters are based on incongruous experiences and frames of reference. So the interviewer never shares the frame of reference of the interviewee, and as a result, there's no way of judging whether the contribution that you got is actually valid or not. He's written this in Method and Measurement, but also in a paper on ecological validity in qualitative research. Some of those problems are linguistic problems, some of them are cultural problems, some of them are to do with your position in an organization or in society in general. Robert Dingwall has written about interviews as cultural performances. So the research interview, where I, for example, get to ask all the questions and you have to supply all the answers, is a very, very particular form of social interaction. And it's one that not all the people we meet and encounter in our research are familiar with. And for some, it may have very unpleasant memories, or their analogies with experiences with authority may be such that they don't respond in the way that you would want them to. So we have to be very cautious about the result of interviews where the nature of the performance isn't understood. An English sociologist in the 1960s, one of the first feminist methodologists in the UK, did her work initially on postnatal, women in a postnatal situation, and was very conscious of the fact that as an interviewer, she had all the power, and the interviewees who were in a vulnerable position had none. And one of her main concerns was, how do you resolve that power asymmetry? And maybe you do it through the principle of researcher as advocate, possibly. Maybe you do it through being more empathic, doing more sharing than you would normally do in a situation where the interviewer is meant to be neutral or meant to just be a recipient of the information. James Spradley focuses, whose work is in 2 books. He died very young, so he didn't write much, but he wrote one book on participant observation and another called The Ethnographic Interview, where he identified the nature of the interview situation as, often it's a respondent interview. We know that's the deductive interview, as one of our colleagues on Monday said. The deductive interview, you know what you want to know, and you want to find out if the person you're with can tell you. So you have a set of questions, you ask them, and they respond. And he contrasted that with the informant interview, where as a researcher, I know nothing, and the person who knows everything is the informant. And how do I, as an ignorant researcher, get the informant to tell me all the things that they know that I don't? And his work is built around that. But he identified an issue which is kind of very common, particularly, I think, if in socio-legal research you're interviewing people who are very, very habituated to a role, which is lawyers, judges, people who work in offices. They live their working lives within a frame and a form of embodiment and experience which is below the level of the conscious. How do you uncover that tacit knowledge that they know, but they don't know they know it, things that they take for granted? So those are issues with interviews that are problematic. This long quotation from Cicero is talking about the issue I raised earlier, which is how can we be sure that there is any congruity between the world of the researcher and the world of the researched? And what are the implications of that fact? I'll give you a minute. I'll put some water in my glass. So what's the meaning of that?
Yeah, because it's this one.
Carbon. Right.
Sorry,
That's okay.
you can still read your.
I couldn't read it.
notes. Okay. Y nos pueden ayudar con papel para limpiar.
Yeah, use this one.
Explosive.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. This is dramatic pose.
Very well managed. So I now want everyone to say what they just saw. Have you had a chance to read it? I mean, can the people at the back actually see it? Yeah. So I'll move on from that. And Cicero's argument is that, and he was very informed. He was very informed by speech act theory and the theory of Grice's theory of implicature. So he was, in addition to the issues around language, there were the issues around what people don't say in the spaces between their words, but they imply. And that if you are from the same culture, you understand. And if you're not from the same culture, you don't. So Hilary and I do speak Spanish, but we cannot understand Chileans because consonants have disappeared apparently entirely from Chilean and Spanish. And so, but very similar things will occur in issues which are not to do with pronunciation, etc. So how do you deal with this issue to do with incongruity of meaning? And there are issues around this clearly in quantitative research as well. So mixed methods research, when you're doing surveys, how do you know that the person who is ticking a box on your questionnaire or saying yes or no actually understands the question in the way in which you intended? And the answer is you probably can't know, but you should try and find out, is Cicerel's answer. So his answer about reliability and validity is that they're impossible to achieve, in fact. But what you must do is you must understand a sufficient amount about the context of your respondents' utterance and information to be able to know where it comes from, to be able to situate it. And this requires you at an early stage in your data collection strategy to think through whether the one thing that you thought you were going to collect is enough, or whether you need to collect other things that will enable you to put what you're interested in context. So I've covered the other 3 bits on that slide already. So what are the implications of this previous slide for actual or potential projects involving qualitative methods in the socio-legal field? So what I'll do is answer the question someone had, which is what have our experiences been in doing this kind of work? And obviously some of the things to do with power, to do with mutual understanding, when you're working with solicitors, knowing how you are going, advocates, knowing how you are going to dress before you go and see them is a problem. Because on the one hand, if I go in dressed like this to interview a solicitor, I'm like a client, possibly. And so I maybe get a response which is like a client's, but maybe that is a good thing because solicitors hopefully are used to explaining things to clients. So when I ask for something to be explained to me, then I will get a response. Whereas if I go in looking like a solicitor, the solicitor will assume, and if Hillary goes in and they know she is a solicitor and a professor of law, they won't tell her things because they will assume she already knows them. And in particular, they won't explain things that need explaining, which are very powerful cultural artifacts in the world of law and legal practice. So that is one key implication of that point that Cicerel, that Anne Oakley are making, and that a cultural approach to understanding what you do as a researcher are important. I'm just going to ask Hillary if she can think of anything else that I ought to raise. That.
Hi. Well, I'm anxious about doing that because, in a way, you know, you are much more of an expert in methods. But I was just random thoughts. You know, one of the things that really occurs to me and relates to what you're saying about context, it relates to what I think a couple of people have said about meaning, you know, which obviously is part of what we're talking about. How do you know what people mean when they say things? And that has so many levels, I think, because how do you know what they mean in the sense of if I'm interviewing a very powerful corporate lawyer, that he isn't actually telling me a whole story about, you know, the way in which his practice is actually really ethical and how they really love doing pro bono, etc., or whatever. And how also do I know that he's using words in the same way? And I mean, obviously that's so important when I've been interviewing solicitors who do legal aid work and then and what I would do then, and I'll come back to what I specifically do with the lawyer then, but I would then try and triangulate that by then interviewing the client. And ideally, I would have also observed the lawyer and the client. And, you know, it just fascinated me that, so I'm jumping about, but so I'm interviewing the lawyer and she's a legal aid lawyer And I would also ask her absolutely obvious questions. And I'd say, look, I know I'm a lawyer. And I would actually tell them that partly because I'd say, I know how pressed you are for time, and I really understand the pressure you're working under. So I want to explain that I understand this. But now I'm also going to ask you some very obvious questions, but because I have to hear from you. So I would ask them, and usually about why they were going into law, what their aim was, and also to try and elicit from them sort of their views on justice. That the idea, because they would usually say they'd gone in to deliver justice to people who weren't going to get it. Great, So then say, okay, what do you mean by justice? And I mean, in a way, it's drilling down into those absolutely key concepts, which are all part of our world as lawyers and socio-legal scholars. But actually, what do they mean? What does it mean to be a professional? And so they would usually come out with something, as the corporate lawyer would, and I say, that's great, lovely. Could you now, and which is James Bradley's point that Pete introduced me to, could you now talk me through an instance an example of where you think justice was being delivered or it wasn't delivered? So stop me if I'm, but you mentioned Spradley, and I remember you telling me that what he is getting people to do is to draw their life for you. And so, the interview would go on and on, because at each instance, I would be saying, that's, fascinating, necessary to say that every single point, obviously, rather that's incredibly boring, and I've heard this all before. Could you now illustrate that specifically, for instance, when you were in court yesterday with a client, and you talked about a power imbalance? What do you mean? So it's endlessly doing that, I think. And I found that, for me, when I was in practice, I was a criminal lawyer. And one thing I knew I could do really well was interviewing people. I could get clients to tell me things which they wouldn't, And so I think it's like Cicero, it's like Dingwall says, it's a performance, yes, but it's also ultimately an interaction. And you have to develop that human interaction with someone if you're going to get them to tell you things. But then it's very dangerous, isn't it? Because obviously then you really are absolutely stepping away from that model of research where you are a neutral observer, which is what Anne Oakley and the feminist methodologists did. Said, that's nonsense. You can't do that, actually. That is completely suggesting that you are this authoritative, neutral vessel. You're not. You are bringing context. You have to, so I don't know. I mean, that's probably, but I think it's all to do with the meaning of words. And again, in what I've described with my interviews as solicitors, especially, as I say, the legal aid ones, they would also talk about how important it was to make absolutely sure that their client understood the way they had translated their problem and then translated that into legal terms so that the client knew they had to go and do certain things. And I would watch the client going, yeah, and the solicitor saying, so you understand? Yeah. Then afterwards, I interview the client. She hasn't understood at all. She has no idea. And obviously, but the legal aid law is so habituated to giving this advice in what they think is clear language, but they are, it's habitus again, isn't it? They are the products. They are absolutely saturated in legal discourse. So I think it's endlessly fascinating, really, to think about how you do this. And probably, but I mean, you've said enough. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Hilary. That is such a vivid account of the kinds of things that we came across when we were doing some of our work, particularly on legal advice with poor people. Right, so moving on from that, I just want to have a look at some of these discussion points, which I think I may not dwell on too long because not too many people maybe have mentioned them to start with. but in doing what we do, these are all issues that I think in terms of what Marion asked me to do, which is to talk about planning. And I do think planning is kind of so important because a lot of this stuff, you can't, once you've done it the wrong way, you can't go back and do it the right way. If you've messed up an interview with someone, you can't probably go back and repair it. So the first thing is, who are you actually going to interview, deal with, get a response from, and how are you going to find them? This causes endless problems, obviously, particularly in quantitative work that I've done, finding enough interviewees or respondents to be a valid sample, and ensuring that they are then representative as well as the population that you're drawing your sample from. Similar things do apply to qualitative work. It is very easy to get a sample that provides fantastic data but isn't representative of the group that you want to talk about. And the issues around that in the socio-legal field of access, conditionality and power. And when I heard Ignacio talk about his work on Monday, I was interested about the way you got access to courts, because in the UK that is extremely difficult to actually be able to get in and observe what happens in the court. There was some very, very groundbreaking research many years ago on juries, but getting access in the UK, but getting access there was took the researchers 5 years, I think. Ethics, institutions, contracting, accounting, and good faith. And again, within your institution, I don't know if it is the same in Chile, but I suspect it is. If you want to do research in the UK, you have to go through a process that may take you a year to actually get a committee to sign off on the ethical approval for your work. Of medical scientists are questions that don't appear awfully relevant to us as sociologists and socio-legal scholars. Ecological validity, where and how do you want to do your research? Do you want to do a research with a judge in the judge's offices in his chambers? Do you want to try and do it outside the chambers? What are the issues around power and the effect of on the response of doing research in different places? And then the issues that Hilary raised of triangulation. And obviously in terms of work, investigating the work that lawyers do with their clients, all of you who are familiar with Austin Sarrett and Bill Felston's work will know that one of their key things is that what lawyers say they do is one thing and what they actually do is something completely different. And understanding that requires you to have some form of triangulated data, whether it's respondent or methodological or other form. And then finally, when you're looking at an interview that you do in real time, in a real space, there is a whole lot going that doesn't go on your tape recorder if you're using a tape recorder, or it doesn't go down in your notes. How do you record that? And how ready are you to record that? And have you thought that through? So, you know, an issue as simple as a pause, what do you do with a pause? But also, what do you do with the facial expression that accompanies a pause? And when you're transcribing your data, how do you record that? In discourse theory, there are a whole books written about different methods by which you record pauses and various forms of non-verbal communication that you might think are significant and that are significant and that probably frame the way that you interpret the data, even if you haven't recorded them. What is the significance of you being influenced by something that you saw but you didn't write down? So all those things require thinking about in advance of when you do your interviews. So do you need some kind of visual supplementary data? Do you need to have an observational grid ready for you to tick off things that you might see? What are going to be, what's the impact of on the interview going to be of you doing these various things that enable you to record this other data? All those things need to be thought through and probably trialed. So those are key discussion points about that. So then there's thinking through how you develop your schema from the interview, how you're going to, are you going to pilot your method? If you're going to pilot it, are you going to use, sometimes I've found that the best data I've ever collected has been my pilot data. So then what do? Do you say, well, that was just pilot data, I don't use it? Or do you say, well, I'm going to put it in the main sample anyway, because it's so good? And what are the implications of that? Deciding on your overall approach, how you're going to think about the idea of rapport, whether you want it, and what it actually means is a kind of really key thing. So does it mean that the person you're researching thinks that you're their best friend? Or does it mean simply that they're prepared to talk to you without walking out of the room? And those things often don't stay stable throughout a research relationship. You start off with a good rapport, and then halfway through you ask a question, particularly in our kind of work, if you're interviewing a judge, and the atmosphere will change in an instant. What will you do about that? Consents, you will be obliged by your ethics committee to get a consent in advance. And when you've done that, presumably you will have built into that whether the respondent has rights of authentication. So do you give the respondent a version of what you think they said and say, is that right? And if they say, no, it's not, and you think it is, what are you going to do? Are you then going to have to just ditch it? And if you ditch it when the respondent doesn't think that you have represented them properly, what does that mean about your research overall? What does that imply for reliability and validity? So those kinds of things are very important. And does respondent authentication extend to the finished article? Does the respondent have a right to say, read your 7,000 word article that you're submitting in order to get points for your institution? And do they have the right to say, you shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing something else? In the UK, in the 1970s, there was a very big action research project called the Community Development Project, which took place in 12 different places where there was community action going on, and each community action project had a university researcher attached to it. And the university researcher's job was meant to be evaluating the effectiveness of the project. Half the researchers stuck to that. And in the end, the community workers stopped talking to them. The other half went over to the side of the community workers and said, my job is not to evaluate you, but to advocate for you. And actually, my job is really to overthrow the capitalist system. So, because that's what's the problem for all the people we're dealing with. And that kind of encapsulates a key problem that I think you've already identified. So this inevitably will lead you do need something when you go into an interview, which is a kind of question tree. What's that going to be like? And then finally, if you're interviewing a lawyer, they will probably say, I have an hour. And as Hilary is saying, you can often get hardly anywhere in an hour, particularly James Spradley's norm for an interview process was 9 hours. And that's ethnography. But you don't get that. So how are you going to manage that hour usefully? And how are you going at the end of that hour to try to persuade the person to give you another one at a later date? If they've been there when you've turned up, which is the other issue for lawyers, that you arrive and they've been called out to court. So all those things are key. And I'm now going to move on to Spradley in more detail, because I think it partly answers the questions that Ignacio asked at the beginning, which is, what is ethnography? And it also answers your question, which is, what about tribalism? So I think ethnography is a problematic term, particularly, I would imagine, in Latin America, where ethnographers were so active in the 19th century. And what they were doing is drawing, imperialists drawing a picture of what they viewed as subordinate cultures. So ethnography has this taint to it, which is very difficult to deal with. And I think the only way of dealing with it is to say, I'm in a position where I have the opportunity, as Hilary said, I have the opportunity to draw the life of another person who is otherwise not going to be heard. And it's my job to do that as honestly as possible, and then to use it in the way that is of most benefit to those people. That is also reconcilable, and this is an individual thing to do with what we think our job as a social scientist is. Is it to be an advocate, or is it ultimately to try and tell some kind of truth? There is no way of telling that the truth, you know, does the truth exist? And how would we know if it did? But we mustn't, I would say, knowingly write or advocate things that we aren't fairly sure we think are true. And that's a very conditional statement, but I think that's what you have to do with the truth. So I think the use of Spradley and of ethnography is as an approach to help you do that job. And I think the same thing applies to other things. There are other influences that I didn't mention on our work at the beginning. So we've been influenced by new institutionalist theory and the work of colleagues, our colleagues you may or may not know, but Daniel Musio, who has looked at the way in which institutions embody cultures. So that's obliged us to look at a meso level of work that we might not have looked at otherwise. And I've been very influenced, but not entirely convinced, by socio-material theory, by the way in which people's work is influenced by systems and machines, to the extent that their agency is constricted, not eliminated, but it's constricted and channeled. So all those things are significant. So I think, but I wouldn't say I'm an institutional ethnographer. I wouldn't say I'm an ethnographer at all. I wouldn't say I'm an interpreted phenomenological ethnographer. So there are all these people, and I think at an early stage in one's research career, it is quite tempting to say, I am one of those people. But it's more difficult to be one of those people and to do all those things that a person like that ought to do. And a lot of doctoral examinations I've been involved with have been of people who said, I'm an interpretive phenomenological something or other. And then they've handed out survey papers to people to tick and fill in, and the question has been, well, in what way is that are you what you said you are? And I think the question is not what you say you are, but what do you do? Do you do it in good faith? So Spradley's issue is to and approach is to say the people who are the real experts in the cultural systems that we're interested in are the people themselves. So how do we get them to tell us those things? And how do we recognize that those informants are actually also interpreting their own experience, not just recording it? So he says, well, the key question is inevitably this will involve you doing something that is not necessarily a natural conversations. And this isn't maybe what traditional ethnographers went and participated in cultures and then went away at nights, and by candlelight they wrote all their notes about what had happened. And he didn't advocate doing that way. He said, right, your role is to say, I am the innocent, I know nothing, please tell me. And he said the way to approach this is to start simply with description. If you can get a range of descriptive questions that will enable people to talk about how they live their lives, what they do, the differences between different parts of their lives, the differences between their lives and the lives of other people they know, the way in which those differences are realized in examples, then you will make some progress. And he did this through these sets of descriptive questions that I probably won't be able to see because I poured water all over my notes.
I can, okay, wait.
You can blow it up. Oh, I can do it from here.
You can read here.
And one of the things he did was to start with what he called the grand tour question, and Hilary mentioned those. And it's say that could take any form, and it could take the form of saying, can you talk me through the period in your life when you decided to become a lawyer? When did you first think of it? Can you then talk through everything that happened until you became a lawyer? And the object of this is you get quite short interviewer questions and very, very long answers. When I started as a research questioner and I did my transcriptions, I was astonished to find at the end of it that there were very, very long questions and very, very short answers. And I think that is the kind of key thing that Spradley does as a technical process, is just to say, this is a way of asking a short question that gets a long answer. So that grand tour question can be resolved into a mini tour question. So it might be, what happened when you went for your interview at that law firm? Can you talk me through the moment from when you got up in the morning to when you got home at night, and how you felt then? So just go through the whole day for me. And that would be a kind of short segment of that earlier element that we've talked about. Then his argument, Spradley's argument, is that culture is realized in language and in the reference of language. And the key thing, and this fits with what Cicero says, is to get bearings on what the language means. So as follow-ups to descriptive questions, there are a whole set of other questions that will ask, say, whether this language, this term that is referred to, occurs only at a particular time or in a particular place, whether the event that is referred to by whatever this term is different to another kind, and all of those. Again, you may all be completely familiar with all of this stuff, so I don't need to go into a great deal of details. Thank you, Marianne. Yeah, so those other ones are native language questions. This language that you're using, what does it actually mean? How would you use that language if you were talking to another person? Now, one of the interesting things in what Hilary was saying earlier on about our work with solicitors and their clients would be to say, how do you talk to a client? And we did ask this question. And what knowledge do you have? Do you put it into practice when you work with clients? And we got some very, very interesting and detailed articulations of what legal knowledge was and how it was applied. And then we went and watched the interaction with clients, and that wasn't represented in those interviews at all. And it wasn't, the interesting thing that Hilary said that I think is well worth remembering is that absence of understanding on the part of the client was invisible to the legal advisor. They simply could not see it because the client was going, yeah, yeah. They were doing that because we found out in some of our interviews with them later on, they went into these encounters in a state of extreme anxiety, that they felt inadequate to meet the needs of these poor people. And as a result, they wanted people to understand. It's a bit like when you're teaching a class or talking to a large auditorium. You want to be sure that when you say, have you all understood, that you're all going to go, and I'm going to think, oh, it's great. But actually you're sitting there going, well, what is he talking about? But I'll smile anyway if it'll shut him up. So those issues are kind of really significant. Then hypothetical interaction questions. Get onto a level of technique that I'm going to talk about later on, which are taking people out of the situation that they're in and putting them in an imaginary situation to get them to bring out this tacit knowledge that they have. Hilary did some very interesting work a long time ago on law students from non-traditional minority backgrounds who were going to law school. And what she was interested in was, why are these Black and Asian students going to study law when if they're Black and Asian and they go to the university that Hilary then worked in, they were very unlikely to get jobs in law firms. So what's going on there? And so she asked them to draw their image of what a lawyer looked like. And all these Black students drew white lawyers, and all the women drew men. And what was that it was so insightful about and then she interviewed them talking through their drawing. And it produced just absolutely fantastic data, which if you'd said, why did you want to do law? They probably wouldn't have come out that well. A lot of the interviews that you've done before using that method were very uninformative. But this projective technique that Hilary used actually worked. Other projective techniques that we've used have been drawing networks, drawing maps of buildings and spaces that are significant to people. And those things actually get people to uncover and outline the kind of cultural things that you're really interested in. Right, well, this isn't actually a workshop, so we aren't actually going to do this thing that I thought we might be able to do. So, yeah, so that I've already talked that through. This is great. I'm getting near the end. So, I think one interesting thing is the issue around recording data. I've had some dreadful experiences in using recording machinery, one of which involved a whole tranche of unrepeatable research going west. Yeah, so the issue of how you record something, having backups, having all-in-one method is really important. Are you going to use manual field notation? And if you are, what's going to be the impact of that in the interaction? And how good are you going to be at it? Hilary is one of the few people I've ever seen who can, in the way of a lawyer, take notes as she interviews and then produce a transcript which the respondent says, that's exactly what I said. But most of us can't do that. If you're going to think that the data that you see is important, how are you going to prepare yourself for the selective perception that inevitably takes place? If you're going to go and sit in there, how are you going to prepare yourself? What are you going to record when you look at two people interacting? I think some form of preparation, not necessarily a detailed grid, is really key. The audio, the video, and then what are you going to memo when you get home? What are you going to write about the thing that happened? And are you going to be disciplined enough to do it. I think that's the other thing. It's one thing to want to do it. It's another thing to actually do it. And it's another thing for the thing you do to actually represent what really happened. Around transcription, I mean, we always transcribe our own data, because I think in the process of transcribing, I remember the interview, and I can then make notes around it, and I can then recall what's going on. I don't make mistakes every time I've got someone else to transcribe something dreadful has happened. What kind of system do we use? Obviously, you can now do this with ChatGPT and with loads of translation functions on commonly available stuff. Are you going to do it? It's worth thinking about. Respondent authentication we talked about. I don't know if you have very strict things on confidentiality and secure storage here. In the UK now, everything has to be stored digitally, password protected. If you have physical data, it has to be in a double locked environment. So that is taken very, very seriously now. And then what are you going to do about anonymization? And is that going to work? That's an ethical issue which you'll get asked about in the ethics committee, but has come up in some of our work where someone has said they were able to identify themselves even though they've been anonymized. Right, so this bit is about analysis. Marianne, I'm not sure how many people are interested in analysis. Are you interested in analysis? Or do you want to, should we stop for questions? Analysis. Yeah, go into it? Yeah, okay, go on.
We can get some questions or no?
Well, there's one person who wants me to just do a bit on analysis. Yeah, yeah. Right, I'll try and do this in 5 minutes flat, right? So this slide is about basically within case analysis. So you've got your data, you've got one case, one person. One of the things that happens in a lot of qualitative research that you read is people have ripped a quote out to justify a point they want to make and put it in their article. And the quote, you don't know the context of the individual author of that utterance. So I think one of the things in analysis that you need to do is to respect the integrity of the case. So what is there about this person's other experience that led them to say the thing that you've decided to want to use? You know, who are they? Very important, you know, to actually account for who the person who made the quotation is when you cite it. So that's within case analysis. But then the other thing is, right, how often does it happen, which is the bottom box? Comparing and contrasting accounts. So how like one account of something is another account? So can we start to, you know, because a lot of people who learned qualitative methodology with me said, I want to do qualitative methodology because there's no quantitative stuff in it. And I said every piece of social science has quantitative working, because you find me an article that doesn't have the word more or most in, and I will agree with you, but you never find an article like them. Every social scientist quantifies the data that they deal with. It's just that a lot of qualitative social scientists don't admit it. So I think that's the key thing. The advent of machine-aided qualitative analysis has kind of put a stop to that a bit for people who use it, but it still is present in some of the work. So you need to sense what's the weighting of the evidence and to triangulate accounts of various cultural phenomena. So the question is, how do you do that? So I always think that the key thing in coding is that you've got an authentic account of how you actually did it, because you do several things. You do the process of what was called segmenting when I did my PhD, which is you choose the unit of language to analyze. This may be a word, it may be a phrase, it may be a sentence, it may be a paragraph. But the extent to which you do one or the other, the segmenting of it is significant. If you're doing a whole paragraph and saying all these words mean one thing, that's a big claim. Whereas if you say this one word means this one thing, that is significant, but how significant is it? So that process of segmenting is important. Then there are choices to be made about coding, which are, you can take a deductive or inductive approach, one of which is you do what is often called thematic analysis. You know what you want to know before you start. You read the text and you see what fits into your pre-given themes, and you put them in if they fit your definition of the theme. Or you do inductive, the most common approach of which is grounded theory. But if you're going to do grounded theory research, you need to give yourself a lot of time, like say 10 years probably, to do it properly. So you might want to do just a version of grounded theory research, which is to start by doing line by line coding, which you read every sentence line by line, and regardless of whether it seems relevant or not, you code it. So you decide what everything means, because you won't find out what is really meaningful unless you code everything. In vivo or natural language coding just means you pick out a phrase which is, like a Spradley thing. This is what someone said, which is a cultural term, and I need to preserve this cultural term. And it's very easy in vivo. You can just right-click and save it as the natural language code. And all the line by line and in vivo can produce flat coding systems. So you're likely to, if you do line by line coding, you go through one hour transcript, which is roughly 5,000 words, and you will generate 150 codes. And obviously, if you do that for every interview, you have a number of codes which is unmanageable. So you then go into axial coding and you start to try and combine them, which is to say this code is actually either the same as or very like this. So I'm going to think of it, a name and a definition of the two things that fits together. And that means that you're starting to theorize. You're analyzing and you theorize as you do that process. And as you then do what Spradley talks about as componential analysis, you start to build it into a cultural system. But it takes a long while. And one of the things that's a necessary supplement to coding is memoing, which is saying, which again, NVivo allows you to do, which is write down, I've done this because, and I've done this because maybe I saw something in an interview, or I read something in Sarat and Felsteiner about client interactions that I want to record. So those are the components of analysis. And then there's the issue of meaning. And I always used to say to students, it's 3 levels. What do they say? What do they mean? What does it mean? So signification has got these 3 different levels, and you need to establish them separately. You need to be sure about what they've actually said before you say what they mean. And you need to be sure about what they mean before you say what it means. So that's important. I can see from the expression on people's faces that if I go to any more of this, I'm going to lose you. So I'm going to stop right there and say thank you very much for still being in the room. And
more questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's fine. Because I think there might be questions now.
Yeah, many thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting, and I would love to discuss a little bit of something that I have come to, that is kind of this game between ignorance and expertise. Because as an outsider of the legal field, as a sociologist, someone who is not trained formally in law, At first, I saw this kind of challenge to kind of validate myself as an entitled person to talk to a legal professional. But then I think I kind of pushed that validation too much, and I start to engage in this thing that you call kind of where they don't explain things. So I saw this tool to kind of play ignorance, like, and I was entitled to do it because I am sociologist. So I was like, I don't know what you mean. Could you explain it? And how you see this kind maybe game where one kind of show that I understand what you're talking about, trying to build rapport, but at the same time trying to play like ignorance. And can you explain me more? Because I saw kind of a tension between these two roles.
Well, I think there's no way in which you can do both, obviously. One of the benefits we had is Hillary was the expert and I was the idiot. So when we worked together, we actually got very similar results in the transcripts, but we were dealt with rather differently. I think there is a tension between the two things. And what Cicero would say is the key thing is that you know what aspects of your interview when you're the idiot are because you're an idiot. And you know when you're an expert, you know what the omissions might be. And perhaps in planning, you anticipate them. So you can play the idiot for most of the interview, but then come in with a question that is based on what you do actually know, that they think you don't know, maybe at the end, in order to make sure that they don't try and pull the wool over your eyes completely and just tell you a story. Because the danger of the ignorant informant is they think they won't know whether I'm telling the truth or not. So I can tell them what I like. So I think there's
kind of annoying at some point to talk to someone who doesn't know anything.
Yeah.
It's hard to build rapport, I think, with someone who is completely.
Yeah. And when you read some of Spradley's lists of questions that you can ask people, you think, I don't think I can ask that, or I can't ask 10 of those questions. He's got a thing called there's a thing called, which I'll just hold up. This is Spradley's descriptive question grid, which are, there's about 100 of these ignorant questions. And you think by the time you get to question 13, someone is going to go, sorry, I've got to go and do something important. But to me, those are real world problems. They're to do with the fact that, we pretend that social science is something different from the real world, but it's just another real world interaction that you have to resolve. But our job as social scientists is to record the bits that other people might not.
So I had two questions really. One was taking what Paz said about, like you were saying about the sort of insecurity about feeling, okay, so I'm coming from a legal perspective. What can I bring into the table in a socio-legal context? And I think it speaks also to what you were saying, because it's sort of the opposite of what he was saying. And I wanted your reflection on the idea of technicality, because I think that lawyers, we can bring precisely that onto the interview setting. But it has a lot to do with, as you were saying, like reflecting on your positionality quite a bit, as in like, how am I entering this interview as? And my question then was related to reporting about this, because I feel here in Chile at least, publishing still in a socio-legal context is very much coming from still like a very positivist epistemology, if you will. And I wonder whether you find that in the UK. I know that there are different journals, that this has a different take, But in here, for example, we tried to publish something the other day, and they were asking us, okay, but send us the number of interviews that you were doing, and the size of the sample in relation to the population that you were interviewing. And we were like, no, we're not doing that, because that goes sort of like against the grain of what we're doing. So I guess, sorry if my question is a bit like all over the place, but just to clarify. So my question is, positionality, how do you think you can bring that onto your report without turning it necessarily into a report on methodology itself? Dealing with this constructivist view in a context where I'd say like a more positivist approach is sometimes preferred.
Right, okay. I'll answer both of those, but I'll suggest that I've forgotten your name, that you find a chance to talk to Hilary later on, because she mentors colleagues in the law school at Leeds in turning their work into socio-legal work, black letter lawyers into doing that. So, right, to answer your questions, Ignacio, the first one, what everyone is meant to know, what Andrew Abbott says about lawyers' interview methodology is diagnostic, and what we found in our research work is, well, when lawyers interview people, they want it done as quickly as possible. And it's like a piece of surgery. They want to open people's chest up and get the legal problem out. And then maybe they'll sew the patient up, and maybe they won't. But then they've got the legal problem and they can deal with it. And it's got to be done as quickly as possible. And it's obviously, it's a different kind of interviewing. So I think the technicality of it helps in one sense, but maybe not entirely in the human sense. So I'm not sure that that's an answer. Then the second one, which was about the methodological accounting. I have a slide later on, which is about laying your audit trail. And as a PhD examiner, if someone's done qualitative work, I do always ask for it. And I do know that I have those questions when I read qualitative work. How many interviews? How did they do them? What interpretive method did they use? And I know that in a 7,000 word article, I'm not going to get it answered necessarily, but I will want to see indications that it was carried out. I want to see some form of accounting in a footnote or in a very short paragraph. And it will include the size of the sample. And it will include, particularly if you're making kind of cross-tabulation assumptions about the impact of class, race, gender on something, that you haven't just interviewed 4 or 5 people. Because I used to tell my students that I think if you wanted to learn a language, how many experts in the language do you need? And you only need one. But you've probably got to get the right one. And if the language has dialects and accents, you will need as many respondents as there are dialects and accents. And the same is true of qualitative research, where you've got that kind of variation. And I think we had that question on Monday as well. So I would say, yeah, I'm sorry, but I think you have to do it. You will have to do it, because people won't publish your papers. No, certainly in the UK, people will not publish your papers. I was thinking more precisely about, because I totally agree that you can provide the number of interviews that you're doing. But there's more like this thinking of in relation to a population, to a specific population. It sort of changes the logic in which you are reading. I would say it in relation to your variable model. So if you have a model in your head of the influence of variables on a specific situation, that your sample represents those variables, or that you account for difference in some way, other way, or you say, my work only applies to these people, and there are other people I didn't interview. I think what I always say, as long as if your work has weaknesses in terms of being a history of the world, obviously it does, but you just say what those are. And if you criticize yourself, no one can criticize you. So you say, my work is strong in this way, but weak in this particular way, but I wasn't interested in that.
Just know precisely what claim you can make. And it may be a claim that I can't, this isn't at all representative, but I chose this, whatever, but it's just knowing what you can claim and being explicit.
We got to 12:30, Marion.
Yeah, I know. I just have, well, I do have 2 questions. So the first one comes from my complete ignorance in sort of the whole sociological framework for conducting interviews. I come from history, where people do interviews, but they do not apply the same sort of methodological framework to analyze them. In particular, I'm thinking about an experience that I had working with Felipe on an article, where it was my first time working, with, the DO's program and doing the coding thing of the interviews. And I thought it was very interesting, but my take on it in the end was like, how is this different to reading? Like to reading and sort of, like, I didn't, like, I thought that there was a lot of theory and a lot of things about how do you coding, but in the end, I would think that the result of our analysis was not truly informed by the coding, and that in the end, what different coding made in actually reading the interviews and then, interpreting it in a sort of like natural way and just carrying that evidence into the paper. And I know it's sort of I didn't really see the real takeout of doing all this sort of kind of analysis that in the end, what you took from the interview was, your overall sort of analysis of the interview. So that's my question. And my second question is, what's the worst mistake you would say you have made in developing interviews?
Right. Well, the answer to the first one is you can only speak personally about these things. And I think it's made a big difference to me in thinking about what meaning is and where I look for it, and my tunnel vision as a researcher. When you're a researcher, and lots of people, you think of yourself possibly as neutral, but most of us want to know. We know what we want to know, and we're looking for it, and there's a tendency to find it and then ignore all the other things. And I think that's just human. If you do line-by-line coding and you're trying to code someone coughing or pausing for 5 minutes and trying to recall what they were doing then, and trying to attribute meaning to everything, because everything is meaningful, that means that you don't overlook certain things. You might you might well not use 60% of that coded material, but you might well find a whole new branch of things to reflect on and think about that you wouldn't have found otherwise. Certainly I have. So I've found it useful, even though I might have been, it was my PhD supervisor who told me to do that. And I think the second question, I've told you about my long interview questions and short answers. That's when I was a novice researcher. But my biggest mistake was to do with recording machinery. My PhD, I was using a method called think aloud protocols. So I was asking people to, examiners of academic work, because it was a PhD thesis, to talk about what they were doing when they marked work, because I wanted to try and develop a model of comprehension, moving to assessment, to quantitative assessment. How do people get from text to numbers? And what's the role of social class in determining how they do it? That's what I was really interested in. But I had to do it with fake exam questions from a group of students who were going to take the exam next year, but weren't taking it that year, so that I could send those texts off to actual examiners, so that I had ecological validity. So we worked out that the way to do it with them talking about what they were doing was to do it in a language lab. So I arranged with a local college to do that, and a whole morning, and I only had my fieldwork compressed into 2 months. And I went to this, all the students went in and we tested it beforehand. They went in, and we pressed the buttons, and they were there for an hour doing this exam paper and talking into a microphone about it. And then I took all the tapes out at the end and put them in a tape recorder and pressed play, and there was nothing there. And that was 1/3 of my sample. So it was 40 students out of 120. So I had to reshape my project. So that has given me a lifetime suspicion of machinery of any kind.
I know if there's maybe one final question, or we just, yeah, I think we're on time. So, okay. Thank you so much, Pete. I think this was extremely helpful.
Well, thank you.
Now, so at 1 p.m., there's going to